Hello out there in Cyberland, I'm Amy Jane. This drawing will complement my Drawing 101, lesson number 2 and 3. We start our drawing with a mechanical pencil. Great tool to have. Nice soft lead inside, a 2B lead, that lets me do light lines. Okay, a single light source. Put your egg in front of you. Remember what we talked about with the egg? It's all about light and shadow, and I lightly lay in just a general egg shape here. The shadow, so important. When you're thinking about realism and how to make it look real, the shadow, it is all about the shadows. So once I feel kind of happy with my egg shape, I then will darken the lines that I want to sort of bring out. Now we come in with a permanent ink pen. This is Prismacolor, and it's a small tip, a 005 will give you a tiny tip. I start with this. It will not react with water, it will not smudge with water, it's permanent ink, but because it's tiny, I can kind of go lightly, and if I mess up, it's not a big deal. I can't erase this one, but because it's a small line, I can sort of lay in, again, just my shape, and I'm thinking about the line, the contour line, going back to that, our kneaded eraser. Trusty, handy dandy. You always have to have one of these, I mean, really you do, and it's so fun to play with. But once I get a permanent ink laid down, I'm going to take away that pencil. This drawing's not about pencil. The pencil I just used to sort of lay in and guide my drawing, but the pen is key. Now going back to my lesson about the egg, the light and the shadow, in between the two masses is the terminator, the core shadow. Come back with my small tipped pen, and this is cross-hatching technique. I know that the terminator, or the core shadow, the place in between the light and dark, is going to be the darkest part, but the shadow mass itself, I'm going to sort of give a general large shadow mass feel. Once I got my terminator line in there, I can kind of lay in the shadow mass, which is underneath the egg. We talked about the reflected light that bounces off of the table, so the underneath side gets a little bit lighter, but the whole thing in general, if you squint at your egg, is darker. Now I'm going to pay a little bit of extra attention to that core shadow. It really is, your realism is coming through here, because it has to be a little darker right there, right in the transition, the in-between space between where the light hits the egg and where the shadow begins. Grab your egg out of your fridge, put it in a single light source, either a window or a lamp, and study it. Look at the way the light and the shadows are doing all the things they're doing on your egg. It will give you a leg up on your realism. Look at the way at the base of the egg, it's slightly darker, right where it hits the table. And that's where we're coming in with a slightly larger permanent pen. This tip with a 0.5 is bigger. And I'm coming in here because these bigger lines are going to be more solid, darker lines. And this is the pit shadow. Right where the egg rests on the table is the darkest part. And this larger tipped ink pen will bring in some darker lines. And I'm going to utilize that too also for the core shadow or the terminator. And I continue my cross hatching, studying my egg. And remember, this permanent ink will not react with water, because the next part here is the fun part. We have our regular old pen, sometimes gel pen. This is just something that you pick up at office supply. This is a Pilot Precision V. Now I'm showing you this bit because I made a mistake. And what do I always say? If I hide my mistakes and cut them out and edit them out, how am I going to teach you? I went in on my first attempt and I put way too much of this regular old office pen ink on there, and I just ended up with a really dark inky mess, and I was trying to sort of blend and using some water on the paper like a palette, trying to keep my light, but man, I had so much of that ink on there, it wasn't working. So that was my error. I learned from it, I move on. Now, because of my mistake, I can come back into my drawing, and I noticed I want my shadow to feel a little different than my cross-hatched egg. It's a stiff line on the egg, but I want this shadow to be softer and lighter. And I lay in just a little bit of this ink, not too much, a little bit more where it's darker. I do a tiny bit around the edges, but I use the same kind of cross-hatching, but we're gonna come in with our water. We got a brush here. This is one of my favorite brushes. They're just synthetic tips. I have it listed in the link. You can click on it, order these along with any of the pens that I'm using. But the fun stuff happens when you get your water involved here, and you got to play with it. Make a couple of mistakes, kind of like I did. But you're going to just start to see how the ink you laid down will come up with that water, and it is fun. It is just really cool to sort of play with this. In my doodle episode in lesson number 3, I want you to play. I want you to use these techniques in realism ways, but also just to play and experiment. Experiment with a paper towel is good if you get a little too much water. Use the paper like a palette. If you want to make it a little lighter, dab a little of the water on the paper or the paper towel. Get rid of some of the water on the brush, but just play around. It's always going to be better the second time you do it. Now, I think about the edge of the cast shadow. It is softer and lighter as it gets farther away from the egg. This is also in our shadow versus light demo. So we are looking at the edge of our cast shadow being softer and lighter. Right up under the egg is where it's the darkest, but I'm going to actually, because of my lesson, my little learning experience, I'm going to bring some of the ink up into the egg rather than put the ink everywhere. Sometimes you can sort of pick some of it up and create your gray shadow wherever you need it. It has kind of a cool tone, as we say. There's cools and warms, but the ink on this particular pen comes out quite a bit cool. And I like that. I like to show that in my shadow. Now at this point, I let it dry completely before I bring in and introduce more pen work. Now, this is another pen. This is the coolest pen ever. It's a Japanese pentel. Also listed in my links so you can order. The brush tip on this thing is wonderful, and it makes the ink flow. I think it's meant to do Japanese calligraphy and writing. But this ink, you can really react with water, and I'm going to stick a little bit more of this in my cast shadow, realizing that my cast shadow is the darker part when I study my egg. So all my ink's kind of going down in that cast shadow, and I want to play with the water. The brush tip on this really requires a lot of control. I was repositioning my hand, trying to get a better angle to get that brush control. Now let's see what this looks like with some water. Here we go. Nice and easy to begin with. I'm going to put a little bit up top. This ink actually has a warm tone to it. You can kind of see it's a little less bluish, a little more on the warm side. I'm just going to spread some of it around, keeping the darkest bit in the cast shadow. And considering also, again, my core shadow or terminator, darker on the edge and light, reflected light bouncing up onto the bottom part of the egg. We want to keep that in mind as we start to play around with our ink. Just get crazy, go nuts and make mistakes. I had to show you that mistake video because it is the best way to learn. And by doing that mistake, it brought out all this idea in my head about how I wanted the shadow to look and how to manipulate the ink. And the biggest part of that mistake that I learned was this light mask that I'm getting into now. So there's a transition between that core shadow and the light mask, but you want the light mask to remain light, and the brightest point is called the highlight. I left the paper perfectly white there, but I'm trying to just do the transition between the shadow and light and keep my light mask light so that it will look real. My last inky mess was just a big black blob, but I got my light mask dialed in. I want you to have fun. I want you to just experiment. And as always, help support me, help with those links and order some things that you need, but just keep drawing.